Days 201 to 204. The world had ended. Well, not quite. Nuclear war had started and was still raging. The United States and its enemies destroyed one city after another in a slow death spiral that was doomed to push the whole human race to extinction, unless someone stopped firing nukes in retaliation, but that was unlikely. The day before, we saw a U.S. military Osprey crash land a half-mile away from us as we neared the mountain town of Big Bear, California. We'd seen one or two military aircraft since the bombs began to fall, but this was the closest one had ever come to us. Rushing through the thick forest and half a foot of snowfall, we found the smoking wreck. I kept Alexis back as Annie and I approached the burning aircraft. I'd been in the military during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, so I knew what kind of carnage probably awaited us. Neither Annie or I wanted Robbie, Alexis, or Meg to see it. As we neared the crash, my worst fears were confirmed. The Osprey had torn open and it looked like at least 4 guys who'd been riding in the back didn't make it. Their broken bodies hurled out of the wreck and into the snow. I couldn't see inside the bay to see if there were others. The fire was too intense. But then Annie called out from in front of the cockpit. Rushing over, I was amazed to find one of the pilots had survived. For now, at least, the fire was growing and he was barely moving, groaning as he drifted in and out of consciousness. I climbed up onto the rack of the cockpit, trying to work at the restraints keeping the pilot strapped in, and having little luck. And that's when I noticed a survival knife strapped to the dead pilot's leg. So I grabbed it and slashed the restraints. Now I had to lift a 180-pound man out of the mangled cockpit and to safety before the rapidly spreading fire reached us. Calling on superhuman reserves of strength, I managed to wrench him free. If he had any spinal cord injuries, I was basically killing him. But if I didn't get him out of there, the fire would kill him anyway. I had to slide him down the nose of the aircraft and down to Annie on the ground. He was too heavy for anything dignified. I grimaced as he landed with a thud on top of Annie, seeing the open fracture in his right leg worsen considerably from the impact. Nothing I could do. It was either that or the fire. Right before I jumped off the nose and clear of the spreading flames, I noticed a backpack within reach, so I grabbed it and hopped off. Not 10 seconds later, the fire consumed the cockpit, with the dead pilot inside. There was no time to waste. I called out for the first aid supplies we kept on hand. The rest of the group rushed over as I got to work. I'd done first aid before on the battlefield, but never for something like an open fracture. Still, I knew what to do. I knew how low the pilot's odds of survival were without a hospital or a doctor. I knew he wasn't going to get treatment for a while, and infection was a real risk. So I used a plastic bag to cover the area of the fracture after having bandaged it and sealed it to his leg with tape. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and it would help to keep the elements out of his wound. We were just a few miles out of Big Bear, and the pilot's only hope of survival was that we get there fast, and they have a doctor. There was only one problem. It started to snow again, but this time it was different. Before we knew it, a blizzard had descended on us. Days 205 to 209. We'd been stuck in a freak blizzard for 2 days, and then once it finally lifted, we had to spend one day creating a sled that we could use to drag the injured pilot with us. Thankfully, he was still unconscious. That was a small blessing because if he woke up now, he'd be in a world of pain. We ended up using part of the wreckage and some parachutists' 550 cord to create a makeshift sled, and then all there was to do was drag him up the long road leading up to Big Bear. We ditched the bikes, they were of no use anymore in the deep snow, and trudged forward. The pilot's last name was Tomlin. I couldn't read his first name because his flight suit had gotten partially torn in the crash. He moaned and muttered in his comatose state, and we made sure to wrap him in extra blankets. His skin was deathly pale, and I feared the worst, but we kept him hydrated best we could, and fed him antibiotics by dissolving them in the water we carefully fed him. Lucky stayed by his side the whole time, offering the occasional face lick for comfort. In the bag I rescued from the aircraft, I found an extra pair of ACUs that I put on. They fit me well, and given all the hell we'd run into in the last few months, I was grateful for the camo. You need every advantage you can get in this new world, and I hope that we could eventually raid a military supply depot or surplus store and get some more for the rest of the group. With a whole lot of grit and determination, Robbie and I took turns dragging the injured Tomlin up the mountain road. And then we came face to face with a bunch of rifles aimed directly at our chests. Days 210 to 214. Big Bear was alive and well, dispelling our fears that it would be abandoned or destroyed, but the occupants were about as hospitable as we had feared. Given what we'd been through, it was hard to blame them. At first, the armed group that met us on the road told us to turn around and go back the way we came, but then they spotted my uniform and seemed to hesitate. I told them there had been a crash and we had a survivor with us that badly needed medical attention. And that's when 2 figures stepped forward. The first was an older Hispanic woman with gray hair and a shotgun resting in her arms, but thankfully not aimed at me. The second was a tall, thin man, probably about the same age as our woman, with a very harsh look on his face and a Smith & Wesson .357 revolver aimed in our general direction. "You the one with the army?" he spat out. I lied, nodding my head. My Osprey crashed. There was only one survivor. The group with me had to come to our aid. The lies were coming hard and fast, but I don't think they'd let us in if I told them the truth. I was right. They agreed to let us in and radioed for a truck to come meet us. I was in shock. They had working vehicles. I guess that made some sense. A mountain town like this would need tough vehicles and the ability to store fuel over long winters. We rode in the truck to town, and to my relief, a real doctor rushed out to meet us, taking Tomlin and rushing him to surgery. She let me know, though, that she couldn't make any promises. She only had a tiny medical staff and no actual operating room to work in, but she'd do her best, and I nodded my thanks. And that's when the questions began. "What were you doing?" I told them we'd been flying recon over destroyed areas looking for groups of survivors. "What's going on in the world?" China and Russia had launched an attack against us. We retaliated. Now both sides sporadically destroyed one or two of each other's cities, working from the coast inwards. What was left? Europe, devastated. The US government had relocated to somewhere in Kansas. Millions were dead. I tried to be vague, making up as many believable lies as I could. I could see the emotions on the people's faces, ranging from hope to despair to anger. I told them I couldn't promise help was coming. They had to be resilient and survive on their own. They let us stay with them, giving us one of the summer rental cabins by the lake. I was grateful to finally be somewhere safe, and that my friends had made it too. Well, most of them. I even got to sleep in a real bed again. But as I hugged Alexis close that night, I couldn't help but think, what if Tomlin survived? And what would happen when he woke up and told people the truth? Days 215 to 221. Tomlin's surgery was successful, or at least as successful as could be. The doctor had set his bones. She was pretty sure he'd be able to walk again if he ever woke up, though it would be with a limp. "But will he wake up?" I asked her. She shrugged her shoulders. She suspected he might have suffered a traumatic brain injury in the crash, and he was battling an infection. He might wake up tomorrow, in a week, a month, or never. I did my best lying to the people that hosted us, but individuals kept coming up to ask me questions. They mostly wanted to know how so-and-so city had fared. I knew that they were asking about loved ones, hoping they had somehow survived the ongoing nuclear holocaust. I responded a lot with, "I don't know. I'm sorry, there's just so little information." It seemed to give people at least some hope, and it prevented me from having to lie more. Most of the people were welcoming, and they were glad to know our military and government still survived and might set things right again one day. I had been right to put on that uniform. I was pretty sure that without it, we might have gotten turned away. I was convinced the harsh man with the revolver, Stenson, would have taken in Tomlin for treatment, but turned the rest of us out. He seemed to watch me and the rest of our group everywhere we went, suspicious and wary. We did our best to assimilate into the town, knowing it was the only hope for being allowed to stay should the truth ever come out. Days 222 to 225. I went hunting with Gabriella. She was the toughest-nailed older woman we'd met alongside Stenson on the road. I could tell she'd invited me to vibe me out, get a feeling for the kind of man I was. Despite this, though, she was far more inviting than Stenson. The two had gotten into very public fights about our presence, with him wanting us to leave once the snow's cleared, and her making the point that if society was going to rebuild, they needed to grow again. I liked her. She was tough but kind. I couldn't help but think of Lilith when I was with her. Lilith had suffered a lot, first being captured and almost eaten by cannibals, then taken by slavers. She used to be kind of annoying, if I'm being honest. The typical millennial that in the old world probably spent her entire day trying to launch TikTok trends and become an influencer. But she'd grown hard and tough in the last 7 months. Too hard and too tough. I worried about her. I'd seen it happen to combat veterans. The world was dark enough. It needed her light again. I hoped in time she could be more like Gabrielle, tough but kind. I paid close attention to her tracking skills, learning what I could. We ended up bagging a large deer. I'd never hunted before in my old life, and she taught me how to dress it, and then we brought it back to town. Days 226 to 232. There were about 90 survivors here, ranging in age from children to Stenson, who I was pretty sure was the oldest person here. I was also pretty sure he was the toughest too, and he kept that revolver with him everywhere he went, always ready for trouble. But this high up in the mountains, the only trouble was maintaining the instruments of survival. The lake provided plenty of fresh water, and the town had even created a series of filters using river rock, sand, and charcoal. It helped cut down on fallout contamination, but everyone had accepted that completely avoiding it was impossible. The average human lifespan moving forward would be significantly lower than it used to be. There were still fish in the lake, and the people carefully monitored how many they caught and ate, so as to ensure enough remained to replace their numbers. There was game to hunt in the mountains, though Gabriella confided in me that the game had been running thinner and thinner. Soon, she feared, there wouldn't be any left to hunt. That would leave them with their supply stockpiles and whatever they could farm in the spring and summer. I could see Stenson's point about adding to the community, but Alexis agreed with Gabriella. We needed to not just survive, but rebuild. That meant cooperation and growing our numbers. Annie and I stood somewhere in the middle, and Lilith seemed to side more with Stenson. Meg and Robbie kept their opinions to themselves. They were both just glad to have somewhere safe to sleep. My previous anger at Robbie had slowly faded. Sure, he had betrayed us and gotten us captured by slavers, but they were also holding his sister hostage. He'd suffered under them for months, and they'd killed the survivors he'd wandered out of the city with. I could see now that he really had no choice. Not for the first time, I wondered what I would have done in his shoes if they'd been holding Alexis hostage. Truth is, Robbie and Meg had kinda grown on me. Now I saw them as sort of a kid brother and sister. Lucky seemed to accept them too, and at night he had taken to curling up with Meg in her bed. Days 233 to 236. Life was almost normal here, other than the lack of electricity, of course. You could almost imagine you were back in the old world. We had our own supplies we dragged up the mountain with us, but we added those to the communal stash and everyone else gladly shared with us. Annie, always the survivor though, insisted that we hide away a small stash of our own, enough to at least last us a few weeks, in case we had to make a quick exit. I tried to tell her she was wrong, that she could finally relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something was bound to go wrong. Days 237 to 241. A group of hunters went missing, young kids about 15 to 19. They'd left the northern ridge outside of town hoping to bag a deer or an elk or pronghorn, but it'd been 24 hours since they were due back. Gabriella came to me directly and asked me to join her in the search party, and I was happy to oblige. Annie insisted on coming. She smelled trouble. If Gabriella was concerned, she didn't show it until we were well on our way. There was something clearly bothering her, but she wouldn't speak up. This only deepened Annie's suspicions. It took us a day to find their trail, and then another day to follow it through the deep snow to where they had made camp. What we found made my own blood run cold. There had been a struggle. There were bloodstains in the snow, and one of the tents had been crushed. Everything else was gone. Footprints leading out of the area told us 6 people had come into the camp, 10 left, one of them bleeding badly. That makes our 4 hunters and 6 strangers. Annie had been right to be worried. At last, Gabriella opened up. The community had been dealing with encroachers. For months, they'd been running into small groups of people in the outskirts of town. Given the location of Big Bear, these weren't just wandering survivors, and they never attempted to make formal contact. That only left one explanation in my mind. These were either scouts gathering intelligence, learning the strengths and weaknesses of the town, or they were bandits and raiders, hoping to prey on individuals who strayed outside the town's safety. Given the capture of our 4 teenagers, it was difficult to tell which. We were about 3 days behind the group, and we didn't have the supplies to push on and catch up with them. Regrettably, we turned around and headed back. Moving as quickly as possible, we'd restock and then set back out on the trail. Days 242 to 246. There were worried mothers waiting to meet us when we returned, and Gabriella assured them they probably just got lost. She warned me not to tell them what we found. Not yet. I disagreed. If there was a threat out there, then the people needed to be prepared, not coddled. But she told me that I didn't know these people like she did. Other than herself, Stenson, and a dozen others, the rest were just regular people, not fighters. Annie told her that they'd have to learn to be fighters if they were going to survive. She wasn't wrong. We had a secret meeting with Stenson and the town's inner circle and told them the truth. They agreed to keep it a secret and that we had to mount a rescue effort if possible. Stenson turned to me and thrust a finger in my chest. "Well, you wanted to earn your invitation to our community, soldier. This is your chance. Bring our boys home." Annie insisted on coming with me, and to my surprise, so did Robbie. I tried to talk him out of it, but he refused to listen. Truth is, I didn't want him coming. Where we were going, bloodshed was inevitable, and I wanted to protect him from that, protect the entire group from it. But Robbie had already been through some rough stuff, I reminded myself. Plus, Annie's words ran in my head. They're gonna have to learn to be fighters if they're going to survive. She was right. I didn't tell Alexis the truth, but she could tell something was seriously wrong. Finally, she wrangled it out of me, and her face went pale. She couldn't help but look over in Lilith's direction, remembering what had happened to her. "Bring them back," was all she said. Then she gave me a long kiss. Lucky could smell trouble too, but I wanted him back here to protect the girls. With a heavy, worried heart, Annie, myself, Robbie bid the girls goodbye and hurried off to meet with Gabriella. She had one other man with her, someone I hadn't met yet, whom she introduced as Marcus. He was the best tracker in the community, and his talents would be invaluable. Plus, he knew the mountains better than anyone, and figured we could catch up with the abductors by taking secret shortcuts. With dirty gray snow falling the entire time, we hiked our way back the way we'd come. It took us 2 days to reach the old campsite, and despite the falling snow, you could still see the signs of struggle. You could also faintly make out the trail that the group had taken on its way out of the camp. If we didn't have Marcus, we'd probably have little hope of following it, but he didn't need footprints. He looked for the signs of passage in the trees and bushes that surrounded us. A broken twig here, a branch bent in a certain direction from multiple people passing by it, and pushing it out of the way. He was a master of his craft, and I paid really close attention. These seemed like invaluable skills to learn. A day later, we found a corpse. It wasn't one of the hunters, and we breathed a sigh of relief. He'd obviously been shot, likely in the midst of the ambush on the camp. This must have been who had been bleeding on the way out. The corpse had been stripped of anything useful, even clothing. However, even more disturbing was the fact that chunks of meat had been neatly cut out of the arms, legs, and buttocks. The chest had been cracked open and the liver and kidneys had been harvested. Gabriella commented that he looked like he'd been field dressed. Annie and I nodded solemnly. We knew who'd done this and what that meant for our hunters. We broke the news to Gabriella and Marcus, who both visibly paled. Then we'd set off with renewed vigor. Days 247 to 250. The thick snow made progress unbearably slow. I kept thinking about the teenagers and what might have happened to them by now, a fear we all shared that drove us forward despite physical exhaustion. Each night we only slept for 6 hours, the bare minimum needed to restore our strength and push on. This let us make good progress, and soon we could see fresh signs of the group's passage. The boys had been literally dragging their feet, Marcus told us. They'd also been breaking branches and bending bushes. Smart kids. They were leaving a clear sign of their passage as possible, and doing their best to slow their captors down. Robbie had a particularly grim look on his face. He'd seen plenty of awful things since he and his sister had been taken captive and enslaved, but he'd never seen cannibalism. Sure, Billy had threatened to eat people, but it had always been a bluff. Just a scare tactic meant to keep people compliant. He was a monster, but at least he was a civilized monster. The group we were chasing, they barely registered as human anymore in my mind. I felt a dark rage building inside of me, and I was glad Alexis, Meg, and Lilith were nowhere near to see it. Days 251 to 252. We were close now. The trail was so fresh we expected to catch up with them every time we crested the next ridge. Then finally we set up camp and could see the telltale glow of a campfire just a few miles away from us. If we moved fast, we could catch up with them by the next evening. There were 5 of us and 5 of them, unless they'd met up with another group while traveling, but we didn't see any sign of it. As long as we moved quietly, we'd have the drop on them for sure. We'd have to ambush them. We couldn't risk them doing anything to the teens. I had a plan, but I asked Robbie to stay behind at the camp. He refused, even when I was stern. He practically begged me to let him come. I knew what he was thinking. He was remembering being captured, his sister being helpless, being forced to work for slavers. I'd seen the same look on Lilith's face after we rescued her. I sighed. He needed this. He needed a chance to prove he wasn't a victim. Reluctantly, I agreed. Annie worried me too. She hadn't reacted much to her brother's death, and I knew she was bottling it in. I was worried she'd snap one day, do something that she ended up regretting forever. Something really ugly. Day 253. We waited until nightfall and moved slowly through the thick snow. Each step was deliberately chosen so as to minimize the sound we made. The people in the rear stepped in the footprints of the person who came before them. Old lessons from my military days were returning to mind. I'd hoped to leave that life, the skill set, behind. Then the world ended. We could hear the cannibals up ahead. The night was still young and they were laughing and joking amongst themselves. Obviously, they never dreamed that the peaceful mountain community they'd been planning to raid would ever send a search party out, let alone pick up their trail in the thick snow. We could see the teens tied up around a tree. They weren't gagged, but with as much noise as their captors were making, they obviously didn't see a need for silence. They'd been beaten, one of them pretty severely. But it was all in the face. The cannibals didn't want to impair their prey's ability to travel wherever they were taking them. But something was wrong. There had been 4 teens, but only 3 were tied up. My blood ran cold. A quick head count of their captives showed one was missing as well. Things didn't add up. We waited until it got later. Gabriella and Marcus slowly edged their way north while Robbie, Annie, and I stayed put to the east of the camp. This would allow us to fire into the camp without hitting each other or one of the tied-up teenagers. However, the tents blocked part of our view, so the opening shots would come from Gabriella and Marcus. Robbie, Annie, and I would take down the rest of the cannibals as they exited their tents. They had left 1 person on watch. With 1 dead and 1 missing, that left 3 in the tents. This should be easy enough. Gabriella called over the walkie-talkie in a whisper, 1 single word. Ready? I acknowledged. A second later, a single shot ran out. The bullet struck the guard straight through the temple, a perfect shot on a very easy target. The .243 caliber rifle was good for small game, but not my choice for human-sized targets. But an accurate shot would drop a man in 1 hit, and either Gabriella or Marcus had put their round straight through the brain, killing him instantly. Immediately, the remaining 3 cannibals ripped out of their tents. One rushed out only to be greeted by a round I sent downrange and straight into his chest, knocking him back inside the tent. My .338 packed a hell of a lot more punch than the .243, and I was confident this cannibal was dead or close to it. I immediately found myself wishing we'd salvaged an M4 from the Osprey, as I had to work the bolt manually on my old looted hunting rifle, seriously slowing me down. 2 more shots rang out from Gabriella and Marcus's position, but I didn't see them score any hits. One of the cannibals was already firing out into the woods blindly. Robbie took a shot, missed. Took a second, and missed. I glanced over and saw that familiar rage growing in his eyes, like when he jumped on that cougar on the way up to Big Bear. Giving in to the rage, he stood up and screamed as he fired on the cannibal, missing him with 1 shot and scoring a hit with the second. I yelled at Robbie to get down, but it was too late. I saw the 3rd remaining cannibal pop up and take a knee, lining his rifle up with Robbie. Instinct kicked in and I swung my sights on the cannibal, lining up a center mass shot, and squeezed the trigger. We must have fired at the same time because as my shot hit home, his did too. I heard a loud yelp as Robbie spun in the air and dropped to the snow, a spot of crimson quickly growing around him. My training was in control now though, and I ignored Robbie for now. First aid is worthless if you're just gonna get shot performing it. I put a 2nd round into the cannibal even though he didn't get up from the first. Then I swung my rifle over to the tent of the first cannibal I put down. There was no movement, but I put 2 rounds into the tent just in case. Then I turned to Robbie. Annie was already looking for his wound and assessing it for treatment. He was hit in the side. The bullet gone straight through just under the ribs. No deformation and probably no splintering. Though my knowledge of anatomy was rough, the wound was close enough to his flank that I was pretty sure the round had clipped his liver but not caused massive damage. He was incredibly lucky, and I tore open the first aid kit I carried and began to stuff both entry and exit wounds. The rescue was a success, even if we'd taken 1 casualty. Robbie would live, though the hike home was going to be incredibly painful. Days 254 to 256. The rescued teenagers gave us chilling news. The missing hunter had been taken by one of the cannibals. They left when the group made camp and the teens had heard something about a worthy offering. I had a bad feeling, a growing pit in the bottom of my stomach. Annie and I decided we were going to pursue. Gabriella and Marcus would lead the teens and the injured Robbie back home. The teenagers were in no shape to give chase, even though they tried to convince us they were. After a forced march and having basically nothing to eat, they were on the brink of complete exhaustion. Gabriella and Marcus built a sled to drag Robbie in, and after only a few hours of rest, Annie and I took off in pursuit of the missing cannibal. His trail wasn't hard to follow. They only had a 6-hour lead on us. I hoped we could catch up and ambush him when he stopped for the night, but he seemed in as big a hurry as we were. Then I realized he probably heard all the shooting. We'd have a chase on our hands. Days 257 to 260. We tracked him for nearly a week, barely giving ourselves time to sleep. Eventually, though, we had to stop. This cannibal seemed to have superhuman endurance, and I had no idea how he was keeping his prisoner going. We'd be useless if we were too exhausted to fight, so Annie and I allowed ourselves an 8-hour rest. When we got up, snow was falling again. Dirty, gray, and foul-smelling fallout. We'd bundled up as best as we could to keep the fallout off our skin and set off. Annie's tracking skills were better than mine, and she led the way. His trail wasn't nearly as fresh, meaning he'd miraculously gained ground on us. This guy's endurance was incredible. Eventually, though, we followed the trail over a ridge and we could see down into the valley. We were now at least 20 miles away from Big Bear, and to our surprise, we found a whole campsite below us. It was sprawling, at least 20 large tents that could easily fit several people in each. If I had to estimate, there were 40 to 50 people down there. We'd have to be very careful going forward. Days 261 and 262. It took us a day to get down in the valley and closer to camp. Our prey had the advantage of knowing the route, so no doubt had made it already. That meant this group knew about the ambush, so now one of 2 things would happen. 1, they would take it as caution to leave Big Bear alone and move on. Or 2, this nomadic group of cannibals would decide to attack in revenge. There's no telling which might happen, but I had a plan to find out. As we came down off the ridge, we were able to circle south to get a better look at the camp, and then we saw it. They had built pens from logs and stakes, and looked like they were easy to assemble and disassemble. This was probably how they kept their livestock under control. That livestock included a few cows, some pigs, chickens, and people. At least half a dozen from what we could see at a distance. My blood ran cold, because these prisoners were obviously not being used for slave labor. They were being eaten. Annie and I discussed our options. Rescue would be impossible. The area was too well guarded. We'd have no chance against 40 or 50 well-armed cannibals. I told her my plan and she agreed. Then we waited for nightfall. Days 263 to 266. I'd learned patience in my days in the war. When your job is to slip behind enemy lines and gather intelligence, you have to learn to wait for opportunities. Eventually, I got mine. A cannibal wandered out of the camp looking for firewood. I figured this would happen eventually. They'd been set up here for at least a few weeks and had stripped all the nearby forest of usable firewood. So I set my ambush near a large patch of deadfall outside the perimeter that had been stripped clear of firewood. He heard me coming at the last possible moment, far too late to stop me from placing him in a rear naked choke. I squeezed my bicep as he clawed and kicked at me. In moments, he was out. I held it for a few extra seconds. Some people like to fake unconsciousness. Annie and I worked quickly to tie him up and gag him, then dragged him up to the ridge. I used large tree branches to cover our tracks and drag marks as best we could. It wasn't perfect, but hopefully enough to slow down trackers. Once we were out of immediate danger, I lifted him up and carried him over my shoulder, and Annie took over sweeping our tracks behind us. We moved for 2 days, keeping our prisoner bound and gagged, feeding him snow to quench his thirst. Once I was confident nobody was in pursuit, we decided we'd make camp. It was time to get some answers. Day 267. You don't have to be here for this, I told Annie. She hesitated. If I could count on anyone, it was Annie. She was tough as nails before the whole world ended. The apocalypse had only toughened her more. But what was coming was going to be ugly, and our group had seen enough ugliness already. Please, I don't want you here for this. She seemed to wrestle with some inner demon. I could see the pain of her brother's death on her face. Part of her wanted to be here. The other part, the part I wanted to save, didn't. Finally, with a slow, silent nod, she stood up. Before walking out of the camp and into the dark, she put her hand on my shoulder briefly and gave a small squeeze. Once I was satisfied Annie was out of earshot, I turned to my prisoner, cutting his gag free. He immediately unloaded a barrage of insults which I ignored. He tried to spit, but was too dehydrated. That was on purpose. We'd give him enough water to march, but not enough to be strong enough to resist. The weakness would also make him more compliant. I removed a utility knife from its sheath by my boot. It was a small thing, several attachments on it like scissors, pliers, screwdriver, even a corkscrew for wine bottles. I'm sure you've learned how to cut people apart by now, probably gotten pretty good at it too. Want to know a secret though? I'm pretty good at it too. I let him stew for a moment. Now, we're gonna have a conversation. If I like your answers, I won't cut you. If I don't, I'll start with the fingers. Once I'm out of fingers, I gestured at his nose, ears, and eyes with a sharp blade. Your toes and feet will be last. You need those for walking. The cannibal's previous bravado left him. To his credit, he tried to resist by betraying his group, but he inevitably became cooperative. I had only to take 4 of his fingers. Days 268 to 272. The cannibals were planning a raid on Big Bear, and our teenager that had been taken, they'd already eaten him. There was no rescue, only getting back and warning folks as fast as possible. But there was the question about what to do with our friend. Annie ended any debate by pulling her sidearm free of its holster and putting a round through his head. Then she turned to me. I love you like a brother, I really do. But I need you to know there's a difference between what I just did and what you did. A big difference. I nodded. She was right. And I felt it in my heart, but we weren't getting answers any other way. I won't tell the group, just please don't ever do it again. I nodded once more. I hoped I meant it, but after everything we'd been through, I had to keep my family safe. We moved as fast as possible, knowing that the cannibals were probably also on the warpath, especially if they thought we'd taken one of theirs in revenge. I had no idea what sort of command structure they might have, but if they were working together on such a large scale, they were probably pretty well organized. Days 273 to 277. Worsening snow made travel difficult. Good news was that it made things more difficult for the cannibals as well, especially if they were traveling with their entire camp. I knew that what they'd probably do is move their camp closer to Big Bear and then send out their war party, leaving behind a small force to guard the livestock and supplies. News wasn't good. Our cannibal friend told us there were over 50 men and women in the camp, all of whom would fight. They'd probably only leave behind 5 to secure the camp, so we were looking at between 45 and 50 in the attack party. Big Bear had 90-something people in it, but just barely 24 of them had any experience with firearms. As Gabriella had said, just over a dozen were fighters. We spotted smoke in the distance. The cannibals were on their way. My estimate, given how many people and supplies they had to move, might take them a week and a half to reach Big Bear. Days 278 to 283. Alexis greeted me with a huge hug the moment Annie and I returned, but I couldn't help but feel guilty as she did. It was so important to me that the darkness of this new world not spread to her, and she had no idea just how much of it I had brought back home with me. Would being around her, Lilith, Robbie, and Meg eventually infect them too? I shook the thoughts out of my head as I reported to Gabriella and Stenson. I told them about the approaching war party, told them the numbers, weapons, all the details I managed to wring out of my prisoner before there was nothing left for him to tell. I just didn't tell them exactly how I got the intelligence, though Stenson gave me a long, knowing look. The news wasn't good. The cannibals had at least a few heavy weapons, mostly M240s and M249s. They had scavenged from National Guard bases they had looted. These would be a significant problem because we had no such firepower. Luckily, this was a community of hunters, and though the people weren't fighters by any stretch of the imagination, most knew how to shoot fairly well. Annie had been right all along. Everybody was going to have to learn how to be a fighter, and we had just a few days to teach them. We gathered the town council together to discuss strategy. Turns out Stenson was a Vietnam vet, and he and I aligned for the first time since my arrival. I turned to my experience combating insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Stenson largely agreed with my plans, given he'd been on the receiving end of the same strategies half a century ago. When facing a foe with superior technology and firepower, the best equalizer is to drag them into urban combat. Unfortunately, Big Bear wasn't a large built-up city, but the area around the lake was fairly built up. We'd evacuate the families from outer perimeters of Big Bear and send everyone who wasn't fit to fight out of town to camp down the highway for a few days. The plan was to use a mobile defense made up of multiple 6 to 8 man squads. Those of us with the most experience would meet the advancing war party head-on at the outskirts of town, and then perform a fighting retreat to keep them lightly engaged and pressing forward as we lured them toward the lake. There, where the motels and shopping areas were, we could use the urban terrain to our advantage. Much like the Soviets in Stalingrad, we would secure the buildings with small squads who would retreat when overwhelmed. The plan was to constantly harass the enemy from multiple directions, luring him deeper and deeper into the town. Robbie and Tomlin would be moved with those who couldn't fight. Robbie was doing well, and Tomlin was thankfully still in his comatose state. The doctor was confident he'd eventually wake up, and I dreaded that day. A small part of me hoped he'd just slip away, but I quickly pushed the thought from my mind. Alexis wanted to stay. I absolutely refused to allow it. I sent her, Lucky, and Meg to go with the camp down the highway. Lucky seemed reluctant, almost like he sensed the danger we were in, but he followed Meg, whom he'd grown so close to. Lilith, though, would have nothing of being sent away with the women and children, as she called it. Truth is, a fair amount of women were remaining behind, and I could find no good reason why to deny Lilith. Not that she would have listened if I had. We trained as best we could with the time we had, while setting scouts along the only likely avenue of attack. Days 284 to 286. I had fully reverted back to my old role as a scout. When I found them, their camp was only 4 days away from Big Bear. They'd be launching their raid soon. I took the opportunity to start making them bleed. That first night, I snuck in close enough to set one of their own tents on fire, retreating to the dark. As they ran around trying to put the fire out, I put 3 of them down with my rifle before rushing off into the wilderness. The snow would make it easy to track me, but I had found a frozen creek which I used to confuse my pursuers. I wouldn't be able to get that close again though, so on night 2 I harassed them from a distance, putting down another 4. Someone down there had thermals though, because suddenly I started receiving some very accurate return fire, so I rolled over to the other side of the ridge I was on. Every kill helped level the playing field, but if they were using thermals, I was worried about the level of technology they might be bringing to the fight. I knew they'd be on guard after my 2 raids, so I retreated and prepared for the battle to come. Day 287 and 288. It was quiet before the storm. Everyone knew what was coming. My scouting let me take a rough guess at their numbers. After putting 7 down, I figured they had about 42 of the enemy coming our way, including myself, Annie, and Lilith. We had 39 defenders. We had the defensive advantage, but they had the firepower and tech advantage. Annie, Lilith, and I spent our final night before the battle eating together, enjoying each other's company. There was no telling who, if any of us, would come out the other side of this alive. Day 289. I led the Point Most squad, which included myself and 5 volunteers. Lilith and Annie were about 200 yards behind us with their own squad. In overall command was Stenson, a role he was reliving from his time in Vietnam. Gabriella headed up a small squadron in a building opposite from Annie's, and Marcus was in command of a team of sharpshooters whose job it was to keep the harassment of the enemy throughout the battle from long range, targeting anyone who looked like they were in charge and any heavy gunners. Eliminating their M240 and 249 gunners would be critical, or we'd be utterly overwhelmed. From what I'd seen during my recon mission, the entire group attacking us was armed with military-grade equipment, M4s and body armor. They'd either killed a group of National Guard soldiers or looted their base, probably both. Either way, we were at a significant disadvantage. The morning was crisp, silent. If they were well equipped, at least they weren't strategically sound. If they had been, they would have attacked near sunset when the sun was at their backs and in our eyes, and they would have attacked from multiple directions. I saw the first cannibal crest over a small hill outside town, coming straight through the predicted avenue of attack. A few pounds of trigger pressure later and my rifle barked a welcome shot, which missed by inches. The cannibal immediately dropped to the ground behind cover, missing my first shot. Not an auspicious start to the battle for Big Bear. The enemy scattered. They seemed to have broken up into rough squads, but they were acting largely like a mob, with poor command and no obvious infantry training. Some wore uniforms, but I doubted any of them have actually served. They were thugs with guns preying on those weaker than them. The last thing they expected was organized resistance. Me and my squad of scout snipers picked up our targets carefully, deliberately. Our job wasn't to hold them there, it was to put some harassing fire and then retreat, encouraging the enemy to pursue us straight to the first line of defense. My follow-on shots were far more accurate. But then an M240 opened up on our location, the heavy 7.62 rounds punching through the walls of the house we were holed up in. I heard one of my guys die. When you're around battlefields long enough, you know the difference between a wounded scream and a death scream. The 240 went quiet suddenly, and I guessed what happened. Marcus's snipers nailed their target. That was our chance to retreat. And the moment we rushed out the backside of the house, it got lit up again by another heavy gunner. The enemy was more cautious now, moving from house to house. Our force was mostly armed with hunting rifles, which gave us exceptional range and accuracy versus their M4s, but we had far inferior rates of fire. As we planned, the first line of defense put up volleys of fire until the cannibals got too close, then we retreated to the second line of defense. There, we repeated, falling back to a third line. It was the same tactic the Russians had used in Stalingrad, and it was incredibly effective. But that didn't mean we weren't taking casualties. Once those 240s opened up, anything short of brick wouldn't be enough cover. The 249s didn't pack quite the same punch, but they were more mobile, helping suppress our fire until their heavy gunners could move up. The plan was working, but casualties were mounting and lines of defense were running out. By noon, we'd fallen to our fourth defensive positions. Now we had no more squads in reserve. We were fully engaged and casualties were high. The enemy had suffered, and getting an accurate gauge of their strength was difficult, if not impossible. What we needed was a distraction, something to throw their assault off. I ordered the 2 survivors in my squad to retreat with the rest of the squads to the 5th and final defensive line. Then I hid in one of the empty houses. The enemy was getting smarter and they were clearing houses as they advanced. I found myself wishing we had claymores or any of our old army toys. Booby traps would have thinned their numbers considerably. I could hear their main force outside pushing past the house as they sent a team into the home I hid in. I let them clear the bottom floor and work their way up the stairs toward me. These guys weren't pros. They had no clue how to properly move in tight quarters. Eliminating them was easy with my sidearm, as I ambushed them shortly after they cleared the stairs. Now I was behind enemy lines, but I could shoot and move quickly without a squad to worry about. Seizing one of their M4s and ditching my trusty rifle, I waited until I was confident the enemy had fully pushed past me and was engaged at the final line of defense. From a second-floor window, I could spot one of their squads taking cover behind a rusted car. They had a machine gun with them and were setting up to spray our guys. My shot hit the machine gunner in the shoulder. I'd been aiming for the base of his neck. The M4's iron sights weren't properly dialed in, no surprise. I readjusted my aim and the next shot hit exactly where I wanted it. The rest of the squad ducked behind the rusted hunk, giving them zero protection from me. 3 more shots and 2 more dead. The survivors now looked around confused. My M4's bark blended in perfectly with their own. It was the same advantage U.S. Special Forces had enjoyed in Vietnam when they used AK-47s against North Vietnamese troops. The survivors didn't have time to figure out their mistake. I dropped them in quick succession. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. But somebody had noticed that they were receiving fire from the rear, and I could hear shouts as other squads readjusted. I bolted from the second floor to find a new position. At least their attention was now split, relieving pressure on our guys. I repeated my game of cat and mouse, moving from position to position. By now they knew something was up, but the confusion helped me stack my kill count considerably. They were panicking, and I heard over my walkie-talkie as Stenson called for the defenders to assault forward. I couldn't believe it. We were winning, and the enemy was breaking. His sense of battlefield command hadn't faded in 50-something years. When the enemy breaks, you seize the initiative and destroy them. With panic spreading in their ranks, the cannibals broke into a mad dash, retreating for the safety of the woods on the far side of town. Stenson and his forces were giving pursuit. The cannibals were literally rushing by my position. I could have let them go, but if I did, they'd just hurt somebody else. They weren't even bothering to return fire or be tactical anymore, just running away in a blind panic. It was easy shooting, even with my M4 sights off. It was Stenson who found me first. His eyes took in the 6 corpses in front of my firing position, all of them with obvious wounds in the back. He merely nodded and I sat down with a sigh, wiping the blood from the team I'd ambushed in the house at close quarters from my face. I hadn't even noticed until the shooting stopped. Days 290 to 291. Of the 39 defenders, half were dead. The other quarter seriously injured. We'd only narrowly avoided catastrophe. Those heavy machine guns had chewed through our guys. Despite that, the town had survived and the refugee population returned. There was a lot of mourning to be done, but I was glad that Lilith and Annie had come through without a scratch, at least not on the outside. The fighting and dying had been fierce and close quarters, and that can inflict wounds on the inside. I was particularly concerned about Lilith. I'd fought so hard to keep her from going over that edge. The town might have been saved, but I feared she was lost. Annie shared the concern. We gathered equipment from the fallen. If another attack came in the future, at least now the town would be properly armed. But half our fighting force was dead. Even Stenson had to start agreeing with Gabriella's lofty ideas of re-civilizing the world by rebuilding our numbers, but inviting outsiders meant risk. And after the events of the last 2 months, I was starting to see Stenson's point. You're not really here right now. Alexis and I were laying together in our bed. I apologized. She was right. My mind was wandering, going over the battle, criticizing what I could have done better, what we would do if another attack came. You haven't been fully here since the kids got taken. She didn't know how right she was. Annie and I had kept our secret. I tried to act normal, but even I was aware I had changed in the last month. I just need you to be safe, I said as I kissed her on the forehead. And I need you to come back here with me. Her words made it hard to sleep that night. Days 292 and 293. The older members of the population and the sick or wounded had lagged behind the main group of returnees, and this included Tomlin and Robbie. As soon as they returned, we got the news. Tomlin was awake. He'd been awake for a day, and he'd been answering a lot of questions. I thought I'd be surprised, scared, worried, I don't know. But when I joined Stenson and Gabriella, I felt nothing, almost relief. This had all been inevitable. He'd either wake up or not. Question was, what now? Gabriella looked disappointed. Stenson's face was crunched up in deep concern. There was silence between the three of us until he finally spoke up. You know, if you'd just been honest with us from the start, maybe. He shook his head sadly. You helped bring our boys home. You helped save this town, but you lied to us. And I've seen what you're capable of. I felt a twinge of shame, remembering the 6 bodies Stenson had found, all shot in the back, the blood on the face from the men and women I'd killed in the stairwell at point-blank range. Because of what you've done for us, I'll allow your group to stay. But you have to go. You're no longer welcome in this town. Relief, then deep pain. Relief that my family would be safe. Pain that I would have to leave them. It was worth the sacrifice. I decided then and now I'd leave immediately, not telling the girls. They would insist on doing something stupid, like following me. No, they would remain here where it was safe, and I would leave no tracks for Annie to find and follow. Gabriella's disappointment cut me unexpectedly deep. The two agreed to provide me with supplies and keep news of my departure secret for now. Within half an hour, I was ready to go. M4, now properly sighted, over my shoulder. Gabriella pulled me into a hug. I wish you'd just told the truth, I really do. Her words stung. Stenson nodded his goodbye. Soon, both were behind me. Days 294 to 299. In a survival situation, the best thing you can do is remain motivated. If you give up, you die. You need a purpose if you're going to stay alive. I found mine. I'd keep my family safe even if it was at a distance. The fleeing cannibals were easy to track. Most of them were wounded or had fled in a panic and gotten lost. It was simple enough to find where they'd holed up. The last one I followed led me straight to where their camp must have been. But someone had gotten there before him, or they'd gotten word over radio, because the camp was gone by the time he'd gotten there. I could tell by the sign he left that he was wounded, traveling slowly in a desperate attempt to reach the retreating camp. I found him first. Day 300. He talked, told me everything I wanted to hear. When I was done, I wiped the blood off my knife on his stolen army uniform and briefly considered burying the corpse. I didn't want anyone from Big Bear finding my handiwork, so I buried him in the snow. Animals would find him, or his body would rot in the spring melt. I shouldered my rifle and began my trek south, out of the mountains. With each step away from Big Bear, the cannibal's last words haunted me. There was an army massing out there, looting the cities for supplies and survivors. When the remains of this group reported back, they'd probably send a bigger force to take the town and any survivors. A man needed a purpose, as badly as food or water to survive, and I had found mine. I was going to keep my family safe, even if I couldn't be with them, no matter the cost. Now go watch I Survived 100 Days of Nuclear War to see how this all started, or click here instead.